What's up, guys? Today's video is all about how to play the King's Indian attack. And the great thing about the King's Indian attack is that it's a system that you can pretty much play with very little theoretical knowledge, where you just play knight f3, you play g3, and basically go king, bishop g2, and castles, building a very safe home for your king, as we see after knight f6, bishop g2, e6, and castles. And our game for today is the game between Vladislav Artemiev against Andrei Esipenko, where Artemiev, one of Russia's top young players, actually comes up with an idea that was actually quite new to me. I hadn't seen it before myself, so I know you guys are going to enjoy it. And speaking of which, do make sure to smash that like button so I know to make more videos like this one. Before we get into the cool idea though, I do want to show you how you can adapt the King's Indian attack against a lot of other different systems. For example, what if black plays an Indian defense with knight to f6? Well, if they were to play something like the King's Indian, playing the system from yesterday's video against our system, well, one tricky move order is to play the move b3, and in this way we're able to match black along that diagonal with bishop to b2, and it's very easy to play this setup as white, because if they go d6, you can go d4 and kind of transpose into a d4 system, where they're not really able to get in the move e5 so easily, but if they go c5, we can also get a very good position playing like castles and c4. Having that flexibility of putting the knight on c3 or d2 definitely helps white. And it's a nice point of the King's Indian attack that can be used to sometimes transpose into interesting d4 systems, while avoiding some other d4 openings that we might find a bit annoying to face. Speaking of that, if they were to play some move like b6, again you can do the same sort of thing like bishop g2, bishop b7. And then again you have the possibility to actually either play your normal King's Indian attack with d3 and e4, or you can switch to an English opening with c4 and take over the center. And that can even transpose to a lot of different openings if you want to try and move order your opponent into a different system, depending on your taste and what other openings you like to play. Now, what about the move like c5? Well, of course, you can still play g3 and this setup is still going to work. And also other move orders where you can try to move order them into different openings, so they might not be in their repertoire. For example, e4 would actually transpose into a Sicilian, so if your opponent doesn't play that, they're going to really be scratching their head at this point. But okay, let's see what happened with d5 and g3. And okay, knight f6 is a pretty standard move. Of course, it's true a lot of others have been played. For example, moves like bishop to g4. And move orders like this are ones you'll sometimes see at a high level. Sometimes also moves like g6 can be played. But okay, it's true that these moves you're probably not going to face so often at a, let's say at the lower levels of play, like 1800 and below. So after knight f6 and bishop g2, well, obviously black has a lot of different setups to choose between. Probably the most solid one is to play c6 and then to play bishop g4. But in that case, you can play against this reverse Torre in quite a few different ways. The simple approach is to go d3, knight bd2, and just put the pawn on e4 in a somewhat similar way to what we'll see in the main game. But there are also other approaches as well. For example, you might decide that you want to maybe go h3 and play it sort of more like an English opening, playing c4 and taking over the center with d4. There are also some very interesting approaches that are quite popular at a high level, where you play the move d3, and then you take on d5 and kind of play these structures with like knight c3 and try to prepare an e4 break. That's sort of the more modern trend that's mainly played by IMs and GMs. So if you want to play like a grandmaster, this is definitely one way to do so. And in order to play more often like a chess GM, do make sure to hit that subscribe button for more of my grandmaster chess videos. There are also other setups with black. I mean, you could also play g6, but again, you can still play the usual d3, and you also get other options, such as playing c4 here, and kind of asking black a few questions about how he's going to deal with that pawn. Because compared to a Grunfeld, you haven't got the pawn on d4 yet, so that makes it much harder for black to get his usual pressure in the center. And if he does play a solid move like c6, you can kind of be tricky with the move order, and play b3, castles, and bishop b2, which allows you to, again, to kind of have a very flexible double fianchetto, where black's up is a little bit passive, and white can count on a very small edge here. But okay, now let's get into the more the other main lines and how the game actually played out. Now we have an idea of a few of the possibilities, like when you can play c4, when you can play d4, and when it makes sense just to go for the usual castles and d3. So those who have experience in the Catalan, actually after bishop b7 you could play the move c4. And then after castles with d4 you would actually transpose back into the Catalan. So those who like to play this opening, this is one way you can move order your opponent, because they might not have wanted to play this exact setup if you would play the Catalan via a 1d4 move order. But in the game, Artemiev stuck with the move d3. And after castles, the normal move for white here is to play knight bd2, and then meet c5 with e4, and go for the Fischer-style King's Indian attack, where you play rook e1, and the plan is pretty standard for white. Like after b5, you go e5, and it's all very thematic, like knight f1, bishop to b7, h4, and the moves kind of almost play themselves at this point. Like your knight is going to go to a square like h2, and you'll often have moves like knight g5, queen h5 to go for an attack on the king, or sometimes you'll also see moves like h5 and h6, trying to create some sort of weakness in black structure. Like, for example, after rook fc8, if we were to see the move h5 as an example, like if they try to stop it with h6, they're often asking for different sacks, like going for knight h2, g2, 4, and then sacking someone in h6 is a pretty standard plan. Of course, it's something I could go a lot deeper on, but I think that Artemiev's approach is actually not necessarily weaker, and it actually also is one that is much more likely to surprise your opponents. And that's the move of bishop f4, which it's a kind of move where you sort of look at it and think, well, okay, how come other people didn't play it more often? Because you're developing the bishop on an active diagonal, so surely it's not a bad idea, right? Well, black played the move c5, quite a normal move in this case. And now Artemiev played e4, which is quite a creative idea, in fact, where Esipenko, I think, was not quite sure how to deal with it, because the critical line certainly is to take that pawn with d takes e4, d takes e4, and then knight takes e4. But it turns out that white gets pretty good compensation for the pawn. For example, you can play queen to e2, and then when the knight moves back, you can play rook d1, and you see it, white's getting a pretty nice lead in development. In fact, after queen to b6, I would recommend that the best way to defend against the attack is actually to ignore it. Playing the move knight to a3, saying that if they do take the pawn, well, we can kind of try and trap their queen in. But if they don't take, we go knight c4, and we get this quite nice outpost on d6 for the knight later. Now, to be fair, I think that this position after the move like c3 or a4, objectively, black is certainly doing fine here. It's true that black hasn't made any real mistakes, so it makes sense this position is quite alright. But it's sort of an interesting gambit and definitely a way to set some practical problems to the opponent. Because the lines I'm showing are based on the computers playing the best moves for black, and of course, in a lot of games with club players, probably opponents are not going to find all the best moves like I'm showing here. But I'm showing it just so, to be honest, and say this is how black should probably play. Also, the move a4 is another very deep engine suggestion, kind of going for that same idea of bringing the knight around and sort of delaying the queen e2, rook d1. I mean, it's kind of interesting to see that even as the queens get traded, the white still has very good compensation, just because it's kind of hard for black to develop his queen side. Like if he plays knight c6, for example, already knight e5 is kind of activating those bishops and giving you quite a strong initiative. After something like takes, we see that, well, black's going to have a hard time developing his c8 bishop because it's tied to the defense of the b7 pawn. So that's kind of the nature of white's compensation. In any case, black decided he didn't want to allow this, and he played the cop-out move of knight to c6, which, to be fair, there's nothing really wrong with this move, but it allowed Artemiev to show his idea of knight e5, and we see that the bishop is doing a good job of fighting for the control of the center. And also after takes, white now has the free pressure on the d5 pawn with the bishops. Now, to his credit, Esipenko handled this position quite well. He played the move knight to d7, not allowing that pressure to build up against the d5 point. And then after bishop to f4, he played the move of d4, just switching back to a reverse King's Indian defense. Of course, as you watch yesterday's King's Indian defense, we were probably very happy and comfortable to get this kind of King's Indian structure, especially since after a4, e5, and bishop d2, I do believe this is a much better version of a normal King's Indian defense for white with colors reversed. And it's not just because of the extra tempo, but also you have this very nice square on c4 where you can pressure the pawn. The black knight on d7 is quite misplaced and would much rather be on b6, c6. In fact, Esipenko recognized that, and he played the move of knight to b8 here actually to prepare the move knight to c6. Now, if I was white, I'd probably just go f4 and just kind of go for some sort of kingside pawn storm. In the game, Artemiev played knight a3 first, and then he played the move f4. And once again, it's one of these positions where, from a computer perspective, the computer will say that it's equal, but from a human perspective, it's much, much easier to play white. And I think if you're able to gain like f5, g4, g5, like that's a super strong attack. And we see it without control over these light squares on the queen side. It's very hard for black to get into move like a6 and b5. I mean, if you play a move like a6, like this might actually be the only way for black to fight for equality. But in that case, we can even play a move like b3. And if they do play like rook b8, trying to go b5, there's a very instructive tactic that I want to see if you guys can find at this point. Oh, well, not to say attack's not the right word, but maybe we'll have a little trick that allows us to keep control. So what do you think is the key move for white to play in this position? Alright, so that was your cue to comment below with the move that you would play, and also to subscribe to get more videos like this. Well, the move a5 is the key move. And the reason that it works is, well, if white gets that knight on c4, black is never really getting in a good b5 break. He's not really going to be able to open up the queen side, and white's going to have a free attack on the king side. But if black does take that pawn, he's actually not winning a pawn because we have the move bishop a5, queen a5, knight c4. And after queen c7, we see that after knight e5 that white now has a nice central majority. He's got that extra space on the king's side. Of course, black also has some chances to play on the queen's side, but I do feel like white's king's side attack, it's going to be faster, and that white does have some advantage at this point with whatever reasonable move he chooses here. Actually, queen d2 would be a nice move because it makes it harder for him to get an a5. So it's always nice when you can do a useful move that also stops the opponent's ideas. And if they do play e4, I should point out that that doesn't work because of bishop takes f4, and with the tempo on the rook, they don't get the time to go for knight takes a5. After knight f6, knight c4, white again gets the big clamp over the queen side, which is pretty much your dream come true in these openings for white. While Esipenko instead played e takes f4, which is actually a very decent move. The idea is that after gf4, generally you want to take back with a pawn in a lot of these positions in order to keep those pawns side by side and have the option of pushing them forward later. Well, Esipenko played f5, another very good defensive move actually at this point, making sure that we can't push our pawns forward so easily. Because if you play a move like e5, it does make that structure a bit less flexible, and it's not that easy to make a big attack happen on the g file if black just plays like king h8 or g6. So Artemiev kept the tension with knight c4. The game went bishop to e6, and I'm not 100% sure about this move, but I guess it's okay to develop like this. And after a5, queen d7, well, we have to say black has actually played the game quite well, and at this point the position is still quite balanced, but Artemiev managed to outplay his opponent in the arising struggle. The game went e takes f5, which I know it seems like a very committal decision. It might seem like a positional mistake to leave yourself with an isolated f-pawn if they take back. But the point is that then queen f3 is actually quite an annoying move, where you're planning up ideas like a6, you're teeing up the pressure on that long diagonal, and since a6 is running into a knight b6 fork on the queen and the rook, it's really not that easy for black to deal with this. If rook a8, white can play queen d5, and already we're feeling that white is just getting a very strong initiative with his active pieces, which is much more important than the fact that you have an isolated pawn f4, because, well, it's not a weakness if they can't really attack it. So Esipenko's bishop d5 is a very important move here, but still the game goes on. We had knight to e5, getting some swaps in to undouble those pawns. So bishop takes, queen takes, fe5, queen e5. And after the move queen f3, still the position is objectively equal, but black still has to find precise moves. And that's an important practical point that's easy to forget when you're just looking at games with the engine. That it's not just about the engine saying, okay, you play these moves and you get 0, 0, 0. But it's also about how difficult is it for the opponent to find those best moves. And this is a position where black has to find a very difficult and very precise move to maintain the balance. And in the game, he wasn't up to this task. In the game, he played the move rook a d8, which turned out to be a mistake. The move that black should play, though, of bishop h4, this is a move that is very, I think, hard to sort of find, especially when it's been put under pressure on the previous moves. But the idea of this move is that we're sacrificing a pawn in order to not let white get his rook on the open e-file. So in that case, after queen takes b7, rook a to e8, well, we see that black has very good counterplay, where it is to bring the queen in at e2. Also, the pawn f5 can also be taken. Like a move like queen a7, for example, if white tries to grab all the pawns, well, black can go queen e2, and already you're having to worry about things like queen takes d2, or even queen takes g4 and rook e2 is already a mate threat at this point. So white is really having a hard time defending everything here, and, well, basically this sort of shows why exactly bishop h4 should have been played. Instead, the move rook a d8 happened, and, well, after rook takes b7, black now played the move rook takes f5, trying to get the pawn back with tactics. The idea is that if white plays rook takes f5, and then queen takes c7, it turns out that the move queen g4 will actually lead to a perpetual check, because if you let that rook get in the attack with tempo, the rook and queen are just going to give a decisive attack. As you can see with king f2, queen, rook f8, and your king e1 would just lead to mate with king g1 and rook f2. So that's not something that you want to allow, obviously, if you're playing as white. But otherwise, the only other option is to go king h1, and black has a perpetual with queen f3 and king g4. So this is what Esipenko was hoping for, and he might have assumed that white was forced to play the move rook takes f5, but it turns out not to be the case. White has a very powerful move of rook fe1. Congratulations if you find that move, by the way, because it's not so easy to see it from afar. And after queen f6 and rook takes e7, it turns out that white can actually consolidate the extra piece here. Esipenko played rook f8, hoping to get in some rook to f1 check. And actually, if it wasn't for white's next move, black would actually be winning in this position, because the threat of queen g6 and rook f1 mate is, of course, a very serious one. But white stopped it with this very nice retreat of rook e to e1. Often it's very easy to miss this retreat, even if you're a strong player, because our natural sort of modes of operation in chess, like move forward, move those pieces forward, kind of like a touch football game. But actually, in this case, we are up a piece, so we can afford to take our time. And okay, the best move for black, according to computer, is to play a move like king h8 or a move like h6, basically with the idea of trying to go rook f2 without allowing some sort of queen d5 check. But okay, this is a very deep move, but it does appear that maybe black can actually still save the game even with a tempo less. It's hard to say though, like it definitely requires much deeper analysis, but certainly from the perspective of decision making, this was probably black's best chance to save the game. After queen e4, white's better, but the game does go on because it will take some time to untangle with all of these pieces and also keep the king safe. But the game saw queen g6 instead, and unfortunately this doesn't really work. After rook f2, well, now we see why the queen is so well placed this long diagonal, because it's stopping that mate with rook takes with queen to g2, and it buys white the time to go queen d5, a very important check to cover a lot of good squares in the center. And after king h8 and rook g1, white has managed to take back the initiative by attacking the black pieces, and therefore white is just a piece up. After rook queen e8 and rook to g2, well, white is simply defending everything. The rook is covering the bishop with the x-ray, so rook takes d2 would allow rook takes d2 here. And therefore Esipenko resigned, giving Artemiev the win in this Russian Championship 2020. So there you are. Now you see how to play the King's Indian attack, and you can see that it's a very flexible system. In it, even though it's kind of a system opening where we're playing knight f3, g3, and kind of playing these first four moves against almost anything that black does. We've also seen there are a lot of ways which you can try to manipulate the move order to your advantage, whether it's playing a move like c4 early, even going for a double fianchetto, or playing d4. These are all very reasonable alternatives to the d3 approach that we saw in the game, and so my recommendation would be, well, the King's Indian attack, it's opening that you can play as a lazy system, but I think that if you do play it in a few different ways and kind of find the interpretations that appeal most to you, like experimenting a bit, then you are going to have much better results and you'll become a much stronger player as a result. Speaking of that, do make sure to comment below what you learned from this video, subscribe to become an even better player for my Grandmaster training, and I will see you guys in the next video. Good luck with the King's Indian attack.